The last thing my son-in-law ever expected was for me to walk into that meeting already knowing everything. I still remember the exact moment. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October, the kind of day in Victoria when the light turns amber and everything looks a little sadder than it really is. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at a stack of documents I had spent 3 months quietly gathering. My daughter Fiona was at work. My son-in-law Gordon Ashworth was at a lunch meeting downtown. Or so he had told her. I had known for weeks that he wasn't at any lunch meeting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit I developed late in life, jumping to the end before I've earned it. My name is Vivienne, and I spent 64 years believing that patience was a virtue. What I didn't understand until much too late was that patience without awareness is just another word for being used. This is the story of how I nearly lost everything my husband left me, and how I got it back. My husband Edward passed away 4 years ago, just 3 weeks after his 71st birthday, pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks, which sounds brief until you're living inside those weeks, and then time does something strange. It stretches and compresses and refuses to behave like time at all. We had been married 41 years. He was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked, who remembered the names of every nurse on the ward, who held my hand during the hard parts without making a fuss about it. When he died, a version of me went with him. Edward had been meticulous about our finances. Not obsessively so. He was never secretive, always explained things, but thoroughly, the way he approached everything. We owned our home in Oak Bay outright. He had a modest investment portfolio, a pension, and a life insurance policy. By the time everything was settled, I had enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, provided I was sensible. Edward had raised both of our children, Fiona and our son Malcolm, to understand that comfort and extravagance were different things. Fiona had always been practical. She trained as a dental hygienist, worked steadily, built her own savings. When she married Gordon Ashworth 6 years ago, I was genuinely pleased for her. Gordon was charming in that easy, effortless way that certain men are. The kind of charm that makes you feel noticed without quite knowing why. He worked in financial consulting. He wore good suits. He spoke confidently about markets and opportunities and strategic positioning. I didn't dislike him. I simply didn't know him as well as I thought I did. Malcolm lives in Halifax now with his partner, and we speak every Sunday. He never warmed to Gordon entirely. I always assumed it was a mild sibling jealousy on Fiona's behalf, the firstborn watching his sister's husband take up too much oxygen in the room. I dismissed it. That was my first mistake. About 18 months after Edward passed, Fiona sat down with me at this same kitchen table and raised the idea gently. She said Gordon had been looking at my portfolio, just as a favor, just because he cared, and he had noticed some opportunities. She said he thought the money was sitting too conservatively, that at my age, she actually used the phrase, "at your age." I wasn't making it work hard enough. She said Gordon could help. He could manage things more actively. He had clients with similar situations, and the results had been strong. I asked a few questions. Gordon's answers were smooth and reassuring. He used words like diversification and yield optimization and downside protection. He never once spoke to me as though I might understand those words. He spoke at me the way someone explains a traffic light to a child, patiently, slowly, with a faint smile that said he didn't really expect me to follow along, only to nod and trust. And that's the part I still find hardest to forgive. Not the rest of what happened. The rest I can understand as greed, as weakness, as a kind of small cowardice that grows when no one challenges it. What I can't forgive as easily is that smile. Because I had spent 30 years as an office administrator at an accounting firm, I understood spreadsheets before spreadsheets had that name. I had managed payroll for 47 employees, filed quarterly remittances, reconciled accounts for partners who trusted me with their entire business operations. I knew what diversification meant. I knew what yield meant. But Gordon didn't know any of that, and I never told him. I just nodded and smiled back, and that was my second mistake. I signed a limited power of attorney. I want to be clear about what that meant. It was not a blank check. It authorized Gordon to act on my behalf for specific investment decisions within specific parameters. Edward's solicitor, a careful man named Harold Finch, had drafted something reasonable. Gordon suggested a few amendments. I reviewed them. I thought I understood them. I signed. For the first year, everything seemed fine. Quarterly statements arrived that looked professional and showed modest growth. Gordon mentioned them over family dinners with an air of quiet competence. The same way a mechanic might mention he'd rotated your tires. Just taking care of things, nothing to worry about, all under control. Fiona seemed proud of him. I was grateful, or I told myself I was. It was a small thing that first caught my attention. The way small things always do. I was organizing a filing drawer in my home office. One of those tasks you put off for months and then tackle on a rainy Sunday, when the alternative is thinking about the person who used to sit across from you at dinner. I came across an old investment statement from before Gordon took over management. I placed it next to the most recent one he had sent. The numbers didn't line up the way they should have. I'm not a financial professional, but I am someone who spent 3 decades looking at numbers for a living. And I know what growth looks like, and I know what erosion looks like, and what I was staring at was a portfolio that had somehow declined despite Gordon's confident talk about strong results. The difference wasn't catastrophic. It was subtle. The kind of subtle that only looks wrong if you know what right looks like. I set the statements side by side and made a cup of tea and sat with them for a long time. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call Fiona. I didn't ask Gordon to explain. I simply started paying closer attention. That night, I called Harold Finch's office and left a message asking if we might meet for coffee at his earliest convenience. I kept my voice casual. I said I had a few questions about some paperwork, nothing urgent. Harold called back the next morning. He had known Edward for 30 years. He had that quality particular to good solicitors, a stillness, an ability to listen without filling the silence. I told him what I had noticed. I showed him the statements when we met 3 days later at a cafe on Cook Street. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he asked me something that changed everything. He said, "Do you know what accounts these statements are drawing from?" I told him I assumed they were my investment accounts, the ones Edward had established, the ones I had authorized Gordon to manage. Harold set down his coffee cup, he said, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing words like a surgeon chooses instruments. That may be worth verifying directly with the institution. I went to the bank the following week, not Gordon's brokerage, the bank where my primary accounts had been held for 30 years, where Edward and I had our joint savings when he was alive, where I still kept the bulk of my liquid assets. I asked to speak with someone about my accounts. A young woman named Claire brought me into a private office. She was professional and thorough and treated me. This is the thing I want to say. Like someone fully capable of understanding her own financial situation. What she showed me made my hands go cold. There had been a series of transfers over the previous 14 months. Not enormous individually, amounts ranging from $8,000 to $35,000 at irregular intervals to an account I didn't recognize. The total, when she added them quietly on a notepad and slid it across the desk, came to just over $212,000. I stared at that number for what felt like a very long time. I asked her the name on the receiving account. She told me she could only confirm it was registered to a numbered company. She asked gently whether I had authorized these transfers. I told her I had not. I told her I had signed a limited power of attorney for investment management purposes only. She asked whether I would like to speak with a branch manager. I said yes. I said I would like to do that right now. By the time I left the bank 2 hours later, I had filed a formal dispute, been given contact information for the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, and had a scheduled meeting with a fraud specialist for the following Monday. I drove home through streets that looked exactly the same as they always had, which seemed impossible given that the world felt entirely rearranged. That evening, Fiona called. She asked how I was, the way she did every Thursday, a habit she had kept up since her father died, which I had always found touching. I told her I was fine. I said I had spent the day running errands. The words came out steadily. I surprised myself. After we hung up, I sat in Edward's old armchair in the study, the one I had never moved because I liked how the leather smelled, still, faintly, like him. And I thought about my daughter. I thought about how she had sat at my kitchen table with her husband and talked about helping me. I thought about whether she knew. I thought about what it would mean if she did, and what it would mean if she didn't, and which one was worse. I didn't sleep much that night. I called Malcolm the next morning. Not on Sunday, on a Friday early, before he left for work. He answered on the second ring, sounding immediately alert the way he always does when the routine changes. I said I needed to talk to him about something, and that I needed him to listen before he reacted. He said, without hesitation, "Okay, Mum, tell me." I told him everything. The statements, the bank visit, the transfers, the $212,000. He was quiet for longer than I expected. Then he said something that hit me harder than I anticipated. He said, "Mum, I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." And then he told me that 3 years earlier, he had been visiting for Christmas and had overheard a phone call Gordon made from the guest rooms. A call in which Gordon referred to my portfolio as the reserve cushion and said the timing needed to be right. Malcolm had told himself it was probably business language. He had told himself it meant nothing. He had told himself he was reading too much into it because he had never liked Gordon, and he didn't want his dislike to become something unfair. He had said nothing. He had carried it for 3 years quietly, dismissing it whenever it surfaced. I listened to my son's voice as he said this. He sounded the way Ethan had looked in the story I would later realize was not so different from mine. Not cruel, not dishonest by nature, just afraid of the wrong thing. Afraid of being wrong about a person he already distrusted. Afraid of damaging his sister's marriage on a feeling. I told him, "It's all right, I understand." And then I said, "But I need your help now." He booked a flight for the following Tuesday. In the days before Malcolm arrived, I kept myself busy the way I had learned to keep busy after Edward died. With tasks, with structure, with the quiet discipline of doing the next necessary thing. I requested copies of every document connected to the power of attorney from Harold's office. I organized them chronologically. I made a list of every transfer I had been shown at the bank. I printed the statements Gordon had sent me and set them beside the bank's records and worked through them carefully, line by line, the way I used to reconcile accounts at the office. What I found, working methodically over 3 evenings at my kitchen table, was a pattern. Gordon had been sending me statements that reflected his brokerage activity, real activity, legitimate investments, some of which had genuinely performed reasonably well. But those statements said nothing about the transfers from my primary bank accounts, because those accounts were separate. He had taken money from one hand while showing me the other. It was not sophisticated. It was not clever. It was the kind of thing that only works on someone who trusts completely and never checks. I had trusted completely. I had not checked, and now I was checking, and the picture was very clear. On Saturday morning, 2 days before Malcolm arrived, I was making toast when Fiona stopped by unexpectedly. She did that sometimes on weekends. Brought pastries, stayed for an hour, talked about nothing in particular. I had always loved those visits. Now I stood at the counter with my back to her and told myself to breathe steadily. She asked how I was sleeping. I said fine. She mentioned that Gordon had a new client and was very busy. She mentioned they were thinking about a trip to Portugal in the spring. She poured herself tea and talked about Fiona things, her work, her friend's new baby, a book she was reading. I sat across from her and looked at her face, which was my face in so many ways, and I thought, does she know? I still don't have a clean answer to that question. What I do know is this. When she mentioned Gordon's name for the 3rd time, warmly in the context of how hard he worked, something in my face must have shifted. She stopped mid-sentence. She said, "Mum, are you sure you're okay?" I told her I was tired. I said the autumn always made me miss her father. She came around the table and hugged me, and I let her. And I held on a little longer than usual, because I didn't know how the next few weeks were going to change things between us, and I wanted one more moment of the ordinary. Malcolm arrived Tuesday afternoon. He came straight from the airport, rolling his carry-on through my front door with the same walk he's had since he was 17. Slightly impatient, slightly purposeful, always slightly too warm to really be either. We sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread out between us, and I watched my son go through them the way his father would have, carefully, seriously, without performing composure. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We need someone who knows this area specifically." Harold Finch had already given me a name. Christine Aldgate, a lawyer in Victoria who specialized in elder financial abuse cases and estate disputes, Harold said she was direct and excellent and would not waste my time. I had already called her. Christine Aldgate was in her late 40s, small and precise. With reading glasses, she pushed up her nose when she was thinking. She met with Malcolm and me the following Thursday afternoon in an office that looked out onto the harbor. She read through everything I had brought without speaking for nearly 20 minutes. Then she set the documents down and looked at me directly. She said, "Mrs. Hargreaves, how much did you understand about what you signed in the power of attorney?" I told her what I understood. I told her what I had assumed. I told her about the amendments Gordon had suggested and which Harold Finch had reviewed. She listened to all of it. Then she said something that I needed to hear from a professional. "What you're describing is a breach of fiduciary duty compounded by unauthorized withdrawals. This is not a family misunderstanding. This is a serious legal matter." The words landed differently than I expected. Not heavier, lighter, in a strange way. Because ambiguity is its own kind of weight, and clarity, even painful clarity, lifts it. Over the following weeks, I lived the way I imagine many people do when they are managing a crisis, quietly. From the outside, nothing visible. From the inside, enormous amounts of careful, focused work. Christine filed a formal complaint with the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. A separate complaint went to the Law Society regarding the amended power of attorney clauses. The bank's fraud investigation was ongoing. At Christine's instruction, I had the power of attorney formally revoked, properly this time, with documentation. I saw Gordon twice during this period. At family dinners I attended, because not attending would have signaled something. He was as smooth as always. He asked how I was enjoying the autumn. He mentioned he had been reviewing my portfolio, and things looked steady. I said that was reassuring. I poured more water. I looked at my daughter across the table and thought about all the things I was not yet able to say to her. The confrontation I had imagined, and I had imagined it many times, lying awake at 2 a.m, did not happen the way I expected. It happened over the telephone, which felt anticlimactic until it happened, and then felt entirely appropriate, because some things do not deserve the dignity of a dramatic scene. Christine had advised me to document any contact Gordon initiated regarding finances. She had also, with calm practicality, suggested that if I found myself in a direct conversation with him, I keep a record. I had my phone's voice memo app open and running on a Thursday evening when Gordon called not Fiona, Gordon, on his own, asking if we might meet for coffee to discuss a reallocation he was considering. I asked him what reallocation. He described, in smooth and confident language, a proposed shift in my remaining portfolio toward a new vehicle he was evaluating. He said the returns were exceptional. He said he had another client who had already committed. He said the window was narrow and he wanted to make sure I had the opportunity. I let him finish. Then I said, as evenly as I could, "Gordon, I've revoked the power of attorney. You no longer have authority to make decisions about my accounts." And then I said, "I also think you know why." The silence that followed was very long and very instructive. Not panic, exactly. More like the sound of a person calculating something very fast and realizing the numbers weren't working. He said, "I don't know what you've been told." I said, "I haven't been told anything." I went to the bank myself. Another silence. He said, "Vivienne, I think there's been a misunderstanding." I said, "I'm going to stop you there. Christine Aldgate has the documentation. You'll be hearing from her office." I ended the call. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the particular physical release of doing something you have been building toward for a very long time. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet, and breathed and thought about Edward, who would have handled this entirely differently, and probably with more noise, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in the middle of all of this. I felt like myself, fully, finally, like the version of myself I had been before I started accepting other people's assessments of who I was. The hardest part was Fiona. I had wrestled with this longer than anything else. When to tell her, how to tell her, what she already knew. Christine had counseled that the conversation needed to happen, and that I needed to be the one to initiate it, not a letter from a lawyer. So on a Saturday in November, I asked Fiona to come for dinner. Just the two of us. I made the lamb dish she had loved since she was a child, and I set the table properly, with candles, because whatever happened I wanted her to know it came from somewhere warm. After we ate, I told her, I did not accuse her. I laid out the facts clearly and simply, the way I had learned to do in 3 decades of office work. Here is what happened. Here is what the documentation shows. Here is where we are now. I watched her face move through expressions I had no name for. Surprise, then confusion, then something that looked like recognition, and that last one was the one that stayed. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, in a voice that didn't sound like her usual voice at all, "I didn't know about the transfers. I believed her. I still do." What she admitted, slowly, over the next hour, was something smaller and sadder, that she had noticed, once, a document on Gordon's desk with my name on it, that she had asked him about it, that he had said it was routine management paperwork, and that she shouldn't worry, that she had accepted that answer because. And she said this looking at the table, not at me. It was easier than not accepting it. She started to cry before she finished that sentence. I reached across and took her hand. Not because everything was resolved. Not because I had decided how I felt about all of it. But because she was my daughter, and she was in pain. And those two things don't disappear, just because circumstances become complicated. The legal process took most of the following year. I will not describe every step, because most of it was paperwork and waiting, which is the reality of these situations regardless of how they resolve in dramatic stories. What I will say is that Christine Aldgate was exactly what Harold had promised. Direct, thorough, and unwilling to let anything be minimized. A significant portion of the transferred funds was recovered through the civil proceedings. Not all of it. More than I had expected. Gordon's professional registration was suspended pending investigation. The marriage, Fiona's marriage, did not survive. I don't know how I feel about that, exactly. I didn't want to be the cause of my daughter's pain. But I also know that a marriage built around a man who would do what Gordon did to her mother was not something that could hold, not honestly, not in a way that served her. Fiona came to stay with me for 2 months while she found her footing. Those were not easy months, but they were real ones. We talked more honestly during those 2 months than we had in years. She told me things about their marriage I hadn't known. I told her things about my own marriage that I had never thought to say aloud. The adjustments and disappointments and deepening love that don't get mentioned because life is busy and words feel excessive and you assume there will always be more time. Malcolm visited twice. The 3 of us sat around this kitchen table and had the kind of conversations that families sometimes don't manage until a crisis makes them necessary. I felt, during those evenings, something I had not expected to feel that year. Grateful. I also spent time that winter doing something I had not done in years, which was working with numbers again. Not for anyone else, for myself. I went back through my complete financial records. Everything. And rebuilt a clear picture of where I stood and what I owned and what my actual situation was. I met with a fee-based financial planner who charged a flat rate and had no products to sell me. I learned things I should have known years earlier, things I had let slide, because I told myself I didn't need to know them now that someone else was handling them. That was the largest lesson, not the legal lesson, not the lesson about trusting too quickly, not even the lesson about watching for warning signs. The largest lesson was simpler and more uncomfortable. I had allowed someone else's confidence to replace my own knowledge. I had taken the path of least resistance and told myself it was trust. There's a difference between trusting someone and handing them your entire understanding of your own situation. The first can be wise. The second always carries risk. I also started talking, first to other women in my community, a few friends, then some acquaintances. Just conversations over coffee where I mentioned what had happened and watched how many of them nodded. Not because it had happened to them exactly, but because they recognized the shape of it, the deferral, the assumption, the quiet erasure of their own competence by people who found it useful to erase it. There were more of those nods than I expected. Eventually, I joined a small financial literacy group at the public library, a monthly session run by volunteers, mostly for older adults. At first, I just attended. Then one of the organizers asked if I would consider speaking about my experience, keeping details general. I agreed. I stood in front of 11 people in a library meeting room and talked for 40 minutes and answered questions for another 20. A woman named Joan, who must have been 80 if she was a day, came up afterward and told me Her son had been managing her accounts for 15 years, and she had no idea what was in them. She said she was going to call the bank on Monday. I gave her my phone number in case she needed company for that phone call. A year after the worst of it was behind me, I sat on my back porch in the early evening and thought about what I had actually lost and what I had found. The $212,000. Most of it back, not all. 1 year of certainty, of feeling safe in the arrangement I had trusted. My daughter's marriage, though I'm not sure that loss belongs to me. Some months of ordinary life, unremarkable and comfortable, that I spent instead in lawyers' offices and at my kitchen table with stacks of documents. What I found: a clearer understanding of my own finances than I had possessed in 40 years, a closer relationship with both my children. The knowledge that I am still someone who can read a set of numbers and understand what they mean. The knowledge, harder to describe but more important, that I am not the person other people have sometimes found it convenient to believe I am. Gordon had looked at me and seen someone manageable, a grieving widow in her 60s, unversed in financial matters, grateful for help, unlikely to look closely at anything once she'd signed the paperwork. He had seen that person clearly and bet on her. He was wrong, not because I was smarter than he thought, but because I was more attentive, and more, ultimately, than willing to act on what I had noticed. There is something I want to say to the women who might recognize something of themselves in this, something I wish someone had said to me before any of this happened. The fact that you have let someone else manage something does not mean you have forgotten how to manage it yourself. Deference is not the same as ignorance. Trust is not the same as surrender. And asking questions, even ones that make other people uncomfortable, even ones that disturb a comfortable arrangement, even ones that bring difficult answers, is not a failure of loyalty. It is, in fact, the most important thing you can do. I still live in the same house in Oak Bay. Edward's chair is still in the study. The autumn light still turns amber and makes everything look a little sadder than it really is. But the filing drawer is organized, and the accounts are clear, and the statements arrive directly to me now, and I read every single page, and when something doesn't add up, I pick up the phone.